My name is Nathan Pierce, and I'm 31 years old. 6 weeks ago, my son told me I was not welcome at my own grandson's graduation. He said it the way you'd cancel a dinner reservation. Calm, final, like, it cost him nothing. I said, okay. Then I went home, opened a folder I had kept sealed for 3 years, and made one phone call that I had been told by someone I trusted more than anyone alive to only make when the time was right. The next morning, my son's bank called him about a property transfer he didn't authorize. He thought it was fraud. It wasn't fraud. It was me. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back. 8 years to be exact. Back to when my father-in-law, a quiet man named Walter, told me something at his kitchen table that I didn't understand until the morning that phone rang. I married into the Hargrove family when I was 23. I grew up in a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of town. The kind with a roof that leaked in exactly one corner no matter how many times my father patched it. We didn't have much. We had enough, but enough always felt like a word people use to avoid saying. Not quite ... So when I met Claire and walked into her family's world for the first time, it felt like stepping into a different temperature of life entirely. My wife, Claire, came from money. Not flashy money, but old, careful money. The kind that smells like cedar closets and good leather, not perfume. Her father, Walter Hargrove, built a chain of hardware stores across 3 states, starting with one shop and a second-hand truck. By the time I met him, he was 71, with hands like dried riverbeds and a voice that never rose above a certain volume, no matter. I remember the first time I sat in his study. It smelled like pipe tobacco he hadn't smoked in a decade, and old paper that had absorbed that smell anyway. There was a brass clock on the shelf that ticked just slightly too loud, like it wanted you to notice time passing. Walter poured 2 glasses of bourbon, neither of which he intended to finish, and asked me one question. What do you want, son? Not from my daughter, from your life. I told him I wanted to build something that outlasted me. He nodded slowly, like I'd passed a test I didn't know I was taking. Over the years, Walter and I grew close in the quiet way men do, not through long conversations, but through repetition. Sunday mornings, fixing the fence on his property. Saturday afternoons in his workshop, the smell of sawdust and Rasheen oil thick in the air. His radio playing static-laced baseball games neither of us watched closely. He'd hand me a tool before I asked for it, like he already knew what I needed. His hands were rough but careful. He taught me how to refinish wood this slow way. Sand with the grain, never against it, or you'll just be hiding the damage instead of healing it. I didn't understand what he meant by that sentence. Not then. I remember one particular Saturday clearly, maybe 4 years into knowing him. We were refinishing an old oak chest that had belonged to his late wife. Rain tapped steadily against the workshop's tin roof, a sound that somehow made the room feel warmer instead of colder. Walter ran his thumb along a deep scratch in the wood and said nothing for a long moment. Everybody wants to fix things fast, he finally said, not looking up. Slap some stain on it, hide the scratch, sell it as good as new, but the scratch is still there, underneath, waiting. He handed me a fresh square of sandpaper. Real repair takes longer than people want it to. I nodded like I understood. I didn't, not really. I just liked being handed something to do with my hands in a house that didn't make me feel like a guest. Across town, at my own mother's house, things were different. Cold tile floors, a refrigerator that hummed too loud in a too quiet kitchen. My mother had passed when I was 19, and my father had remarried a woman who treated affection like a transaction given only when something was expected in return. So Walter's house became something my own childhood hadn't been. Warm, safe, earned, not bought. But there were other people circling that warmth too. My wife's brother, Preston, visited Walter often in those years, but his visits had a rhythm to them. He came when the stores were doing well. He asked about valuations and liquidity at dinner, words that didn't belong at a dinner table. He'd laugh at Walter's old stories, but his eyes would drift to the clock, or the deed box on the shelf, or the framed photo of the original storefront, like he was pricing the room. I remember one Christmas, Preston brought a friend along, a man in an expensive coat who said very little and spent most of dinner studying the layout of the house rather than the food on his plate. Preston introduced him only as a colleague. Walter shook the man's hand politely and later that night quietly mentioned to me that he didn't appreciate strangers walking through his home, taking inventory with their eyes. Another time, I watched Preston ask Walter, almost casually, what the stores were worth on paper these days. In the middle of Walter describing how he'd opened the very first one with money borrowed from his own father, Walter answered the question simply, then changed the subject back to the story. Preston never noticed, or never cared, that he'd interrupted a memory with a number. Walter noticed. Walter always noticed. He just never said anything. Not yet. One evening, as I was leaving, Walter stopped me at the door. The porch light buzzed faintly above us, moths circling it like they had nowhere better to be. "Nathan," he said, "inheritance isn't about who shows up at the funeral. It's about who shows up when no one's watching and nothing's being handed out." Yet, I told him that was a strange thing to say. He just smiled and said, "You'll understand it eventually. Most people understand it too late." I didn't know yet that he meant it as a warning. Walter passed when I was 26. A stroke. Quick. No long goodbye. No chance to ask the questions I didn't know I'd need answered. At the funeral, I watched the family the way you watch weather change slowly. Then all at once, Preston cried for exactly as long as people were watching him cry. The moment the small talk turned toward logistics, his word, not mine, his voice changed register entirely. Flat, efficient, like he'd rehearsed it. "We'll need to get the estate appraised quickly," he said to the lawyer, 3 days after the burial, standing in the same study that used to smell like pipe tobacco. Time-sensitive opportunities don't wait for grief. Time-sensitive opportunities. That's the phrase he used. Not Dad's legacy. Not the stores he built with his hands. Time-sensitive opportunities. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. I said nothing. I had learned somewhere in those 8 years that the quietest person in the room is often the only one actually listening. I watched Preston move through Walter's belongings like a man doing inventory, not grieving a father. I watched my wife's mother, distant and medicated through most of it, signed whatever was placed in front of her. I watched Claire, my own wife, slowly drawn into Preston's orbit, agreeing with him more than she disagreed, because disagreeing with her brother had never once gone well for her. There was a moment, maybe 2 weeks after the funeral, when I walked into Walter's study to retrieve a box of tools I'd asked permission to keep. Preston was already there, going through a filing cabinet. Papers spread across the same desk where Walter used to pour 2 glasses of bourbon neither of us finished. He didn't look up when I walked in. "You can take the tools," he said, like he was approving an expense. "Nobody else wants them anyway." I picked up the box without answering. On my way out, I noticed he'd already had the brass clock removed from the shelf, the one that ticked just slightly too loud. It was sitting in a cardboard box marked, in his handwriting, "Assess value." I took that clock home with me that same week. I didn't ask permission. Nobody noticed it was gone for almost a year. I had no power in that house. Not officially. My name wasn't on a single deed. My signature meant nothing to a single account. So I did the only thing I could do. I watched. Remembered. I kept the small things alive. Walter's tools, oiled and organized exactly how he'd left them. The fence we built together, repaired every spring, whether anyone asked or not. A man's legacy isn't just paper. Sometimes it's the version of him that only one person bothers to maintain. I became, without meaning to, invisible in that family. And somewhere in that invisibility, I made a decision. I didn't know what shape it would take yet. I only knew this: if no one was watching me, then no one would see me coming either. Have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself, even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. 2 years after Walter died, Preston had restructured almost everything. The hardware chain was sold off in pieces. The proceeds, folded into investments I never saw documentation for. Family gatherings became performances Preston at the head of the table now, talking about growth strategy at Thanksgiving, like Walter's name was a brand he'd inherited rather than a father he'd buried. He started referring to the original 3 stores, the ones Walter had built with his own hands, borrowed money, and a second-hand truck as legacy assets. Not home, not dad's stores, legacy assets. He said it the way you'd describe furniture you were planning to sell at an estate sale. Claire and I had our son Mason during this stretch. I told myself the cold business language happening around us didn't matter as long as our own home stayed warm. I'd come home from those dinners, sit in Mason's nursery in the dark, and just listen to him breathe. It felt like the only honest sound left in the family. But warmth doesn't insulate you forever from people circling what's left. It was a Tuesday evening. Gray light through the kitchen window. The smell of Claire's cooking thick in the air when I walked past the study door slightly ajar and heard my name. I stopped. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but some sentences pull your feet to a stop, whether you intend them to or not. Nathan doesn't need to be involved in any of it, Preston was saying, his voice low, businesslike. He married in. He has no claim, no name on anything. The boy, Mason, that's the only connection that matters going forward. Once he's old enough, we manage things through him. Keep Nathan at arm's length. Claire said something I couldn't hear clearly. Something that sounded like hesitation, not defense. I stood in that hallway for maybe 4 seconds, long enough to understand that I had become, in their eyes, a veritable to be managed rather than a person to be considered. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. My hand was steady. I said nothing that night, or the next, or the next. I'll think about it, I told myself. Not yet. What they didn't know, what nobody but a lawyer named Margaret Voss knew, is that Walter Hargrove had not been careless with his legacy. He had been patient. 3 months after that overheard conversation, a letter arrived at my office. Plain envelope, no return address I recognized. Inside was a single key and a note in handwriting I knew instantly, because I'd watched that same hand sand wood against the grain 100 Saturday mornings. For when the time is right, you'll know when. Dup. The key opened a safety deposit box at a regional bank 2 towns over when Walter had used for decades, separate from the family's primary accounts, separate from anything Preston had ever touched or appraised. Inside, I found documents I hadn't known existed. A secondary trust established 11 years earlier, before Preston's visits had, developed their rhythm of valuations and liquidity. A controlling minority stake in 3 commercial properties, the original, storefronts, the land beneath them, never folded into the sale Preston had orchestrated, and a name listed as trustee and executor of that secondary trust. Mine, not. Mason's, not Claire's. Mine. Attached was a card from Margaret Voss, estate attorney, with a note. She has held this for you since the week your son was born. Call her when you understand what your silence has been worth. I called Margaret the next morning. Her office smelled like coffee and old carpet, and she spoke the way Walter used to calm, exact, no wasted words. Walter came to me 11 years ago, she said, sliding a folder across her desk. He told me his son-in-law was the only person in that family who'd ever asked him what he wanted, instead of what he had. He said, Preston will try to take everything. Nathan won't even ask for anything. That's exactly why I'm giving him the part Preston can't touch. She explained the trust in full. The properties under Preston's restructuring, the ones he'd already shown to investors, already discussed time-sensitive opportunities about, were never fully his to sell. The secondary trust held binding rights over the land itself. Preston had built his entire plan on top of a foundation he didn't actually own. He had been negotiating for months the sale of property he had no full legal claim to liquidate. He just didn't know it yet. I didn't act immediately. Margaret had been clear there was a difference between having power and using it carelessly. Walter wanted you to wait until the moment mattered, she said. Not the moment you felt angry. The moment it would actually count, ... So, I waited. I went to family dinners. I let Preston call me barely family, under his breath at gatherings, the way he'd taken to doing in recent years. I let Mason grow up calling me dad while his uncle slowly tried to position himself as the responsible adult in the boy's financial future. I heard eventually the exact number through Claire, who didn't know what she was telling me. Preston had a buyer lined up for the commercial properties. $4.2 million. Closing was scheduled for the week after Mason's high school graduation. Preston had told the buyer confidently that all parties are aligned and there will be no complications. He said that on a Thursday. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to turn. The graduation came up fast, the way milestones do once you stop watching the calendar and start watching your son grow instead. I had RSVP'd. I had bought Mason a watch, Walter's actual watch, the one I'd kept oiled and ticking for years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on. 3 days before the ceremony, Preston called me. Not Claire, me, directly, which told me something was wrong before he said a word. "Nathan," he said, "I think it's better if you sit this one out." I asked him why. "It's a family moment," he said. "A real family moment. I don't think it's appropriate for you to be there, given everything." I asked what everything meant. He didn't answer that. He just said, "I've already spoken to Claire. She agrees it's cleaner this way." Cleaner. Another word that used to mean nothing and now meant everything. I said, "Okay, that's it. Just okay." He seemed surprised by how easily I let it go. He shouldn't have been. Walter taught me that the people who fight the loudest in the moment usually have the least power. The people with real power don't need to raise their voice at all. That night, I sat in my home office. The house was quiet. Claire had taken Mason out for a pre-graduation dinner I hadn't been invited to. The only sound was the old brass clock on my shelf, the one I'd taken from Walter's study after he passed, ticking just slightly too loud, the same way it always had. It was 11:51 p.m. I opened the folder Margaret had helped me prepare months earlier. The paperwork to formally activate the trust's blocking rights, the legal mechanism that would freeze any pending transaction involving the properties Preston had no authority to sell. I signed where Margaret had marked. I looked at the clock. 12:03 a.m. I am 31 years old. I am the trustee of everything Walter Hargrove actually built. Across town, Preston was almost certainly already asleep, confident in a $4.2 million deal closing in 11 days. He had no idea that the ground beneath that deal had already shifted hours earlier. He'd find that out in about 36 hours, when his own bank's compliance department flagged the transaction. The graduation happened without me. I watched it later. From photos, Claire texted me out of some lingering guilt Mason in his cap and gown, Preston standing beside him in pictures where I should have been standing instead. 2 days after that, on a Tuesday morning, Preston called me again. His voice was different this time, higher, faster. "Nathan, there's some kind of error with the property transfer. The bank says there's a blocking trust filed against the deed. Do you know anything about this?" I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. "I know everything about it," I said. He went quiet, the kind of quiet that used to belong to me. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," I said. "Walter did. 11 years ago. I just signed the paperwork to use what he already built." He looked at me over video call, 3 days later, when we finally sat across from each other with Margaret present, like I was still the man he'd dismissed his whole marriage. Into this family, quiet, harmless, easy to talk over. I wasn't. I hadn't been for years. He asked, almost pleading, if there was a way to work something out. I told him the trust terms were not negotiable and that Margaret would be handling all further communication. He didn't apologize. People like Preston rarely do. He just got quieter, the way people do when the script they've been performing their entire life suddenly stops working. The deal collapsed within the month. The properties stayed exactly where Walter intended them to stay, under careful, patient control. Not liquidated for a number on a spreadsheet. Walter used to say. Sanding wood against my hands on quiet Saturday mornings. Sand with the grain, never against it, or you'll just be hiding the damage instead of healing it. I thought he meant woodworking. He meant patience. He meant that fighting people loudly in the moment only hides the real damage instead of fixing it. real repair. Takes time, direction, and the right tools used at the right moment. Not the angriest one. Preston still attends family events, technically. He talks less now. The time-sensitive opportunities language disappeared from his vocabulary somewhere around the same time his leverage did. Margaret still manages the trust with me. Twice a year, over coffee that tastes like her office always smells old carpet and quiet competence. As for me, I still have the watch. Walter's watch. I gave it to Mason eventually, properly, at a dinner where I was very much invited. I think about Walter every time I hear a clock tick just slightly too loud in a quiet room. And I think, some people inherit money. I inherited patience. Walter made sure I understood, eventually, that patience was worth more. If you've ever had to stay quiet, wait, and let your actions speak instead of your voice, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more like it coming.